Hello, this time on Sitrep, the architects of the ongoing defence review give us a rare insight into their thinking.
Intimidating our enemies, inspiring our friends. That's what I hope the review will do.
Sian was in the room for that session with the Commons Defence Committee. She joins us to explain more and discuss a very stark warning from a Defence Minister about how quickly our army could be destroyed in a large-scale war. Just weeks after the UK and the US announced a drawdown of their Syria-related operations, there's been a resurgence in that country's civil war. Could that prompt a rethink? And we talked to Brigadier Gavin Thompson, commander of the British military mission Kuwait, about 125 years of ties between our countries and what he's doing there.
Sitrep with Kate Chabot and Professor Michael Clark.
Well, we talked when the Defence Review was announced about the significance of outside experts being put in charge of the work. And this week, two of the key figures, former NATO Secretary-General Lord Robertson and retired General Sir Richard Barrons, appeared before MPs to face public and private questions about the review. To me, it feels very different to previous reviews, Mike, and potentially a significant insight into work that will eventually determine the future of our defence and armed forces.
Yes, I mean, in terms of the process, certainly this is a different process to any defence review I've been party to or known of since going back to the early 1990s, mainly because a lot of outside work is being done first instead of later on, or sort of in conjunction with the review. So while the MOD is gearing up for what it wants to do, Lord Robertson is leading this thing from the top down, from the outside, and all that material is going in before Christmas. And a lot of people have been involved in this review, panels of people, several panels, 20 odd. And that's all going in via Lord Robertson, Richard Barrons and Fiona Hill, in a sense now, as the review gets down to the specifics of the force structure. So this is the opposite way round of doing it to all of the other reviews, which did it within the MOD, and then at some point, quite late on, put it to the outside world and said, what do you think? And of course, by then, whatever the outside world thought was too late to make a real difference. In this case, we don't know if it will make a real difference because you've got to put the two bits together. But the first bit is certainly fairly impressive in its scope and in the individuals involved.
Well, let's bring in Sian Grzeszczyk, Melbourne. Sian, hi. It was an hour of public evidence that you listened to. Can you give us a quick run through of the standout things that you learned?
Yes, well, Kate, this was the first time we've learned just how many people have contributed to the review and also how they've been sorting through the material. They've been using AI to sift through 8,000 submissions that they've received. Now, there were originally 14,500 expressions of interest, they said. So clearly quite a few people decided not to contribute in the end, but 8,000 still a very significant number. They said it would take them sort of years to go through all of that. And that's why they're bringing in AI to sift through it. Lord Robertson revealed that he has a weekly meeting with the Defence Secretary, John Healey, about the review. They've also had a meeting with the Prime Minister, the Chancellor. They've been to SHAPE, they've spoken to Sakir, so they know what NATO wants. When questioned about him being one of the reviewers and having left the armed forces a long time ago, General Sir Richard Barrons, in response to that, said he only does defence and security. And quite tellingly, I know where the skeletons are likely to be. Unsurprisingly, the US relationship and whether they might move away from Europe came up. They had some questions on that. And he said, Lord Robertson said, he doesn't think that will happen. He listed some achievements of the last Trump administration on defence spending and made the point about Europeans having to take on more of the burden currently held by the US. And another interesting revelation in response to that was that he said they do have an American officer as part of the Secretariat. So, they're clearly making sure allies are involved and have a direct link to Washington on some of these things. General Barrons told them, we aren't just looking at the front end of defence, we are absolutely looking at everything.
And Sian, I note that list does not include a completion date for the review.
Indeed. Everyone is very tight-lipped about when we get to see the results. The official line from the government, of course, it will be published in the spring. But I had some interesting conversations this week with senior defence sources. I wanted to see if there might be any surprises in terms of the timeline. And I said, we won't, for example, see it as early as January. And they said, that's very, very unlikely. Then they paused, frowned, took a very deep intake of breath and said, that would absolutely give me a heart attack if it was January. Now, the second conversation I had, I asked if they were going to if they were putting a bet on it, where would they be putting their money for when it's published? And they said, well, some people think it might slip to as far as June, but if they were betting, they'd put their money on March. So we're no further forward, really, from those conversations. So it's either not fully set or is being kept incredibly well under wraps. But the response rate to this review, you know, those thousands of submissions, getting through all of those will no doubt have an impact on the timescale as well.
Yeah, and Mike, essentially that they've given nothing away about what will come out of this review, but some considerable detail about the process they're going through to get there, which you've talked about a bit. Does that in itself help us understand how it's going?
Well, not in itself, but we can guess, because there has been a big effort, as Sian said, to keep allies on board, not to come up with a review and then put it to the allies to try and integrate all of those things. So they're certainly trying to do it the right way round. But the essence of this review is that it's taking place on the very much darkened international scene. So the last integrated review, which is really the post-Brexit review, which should have been done in 2019, 2020, and because of COVID, it didn't come out till 2021. And that was very, very much a review that was about how can Britain cope with its Brexit future. And it was good as an essay, but it didn't help in policy terms all that much. But here we are now, 2022, invasion of Ukraine. The world is changing very, very rapidly. The security situation is darkening, not just in Europe, but partly because of what's happening in Europe, elsewhere as well. And so this review will have to hit the ground running. And I don't think any of us will be surprised if this is a very sobering assessment of our future and a very tough ask for the government to address it properly. And of course, the big issue is if it asks too much, in a sense, if it is too honest, the temptation will be for the government just to ignore it because it's too difficult. I mean, governments ignore things which are simply too hard. And so George Robertson's task and the authors, the internal authors of the review, will be to pitch this sobering message. And what I suspect will be a pretty big ask, pitch it in a way that politicians will react favourably and not kick it out because they just can't conceive that it could really be that bad.
OK, well, let's hear from General Sir Richard Barrons now. Here he is answering a question about how this review will differ from those that went before.
We remind ourselves every morning that every review in my working life has failed generally within 2 years for a combination of two reasons. The first is they haven't predicted what's actually happened in the world. So the 97 review obviously didn't predict 9/11 and the many other examples. So our objective has to be as least wrong as possible in terms of how we design a formula for the future.
Mike, the phrase as least wrong as possible might not entirely inspire confidence, but I suppose that there's an absolute honesty to it, isn't there? How does it make you feel about the possibility of this review failing or not within 2 years?
I don't think it will fail within 2 years, but I think what Richard Barrons was saying is that, when reviews try to say we're in this sort of conflict or that sort of conflict, life tends to frustrate us. And that goes back to the John Knott review. In 1981, cut back the Navy. And then the following year, 1982, we were doing the Falklands. We had to send the whole of the Navy to the Falklands. And as Richard said, 9/11 seemed to usher in a new type of warfare. And then here we were in the 2010s, 2015, having to look then at yet another new type of warfare as we got out of Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think what Richard's saying is we're not trying to anticipate the next type of warfare as such, so much as to say, how can we create a defence policy which is agile enough to react? We always talk about agility, but we just don't do it. It's very hard. And so we've got to produce a defence policy which really can be a bit flexible, work from the bottom up, not the top down. And then whatever happens in the mid-2020s, the only thing we're confident about is it won't be very good. But, it won't be in our interest. But whatever happens will be something that will be hard to foresee for now. So it's no good designing a force structure which looks good for 2022-23, when by 27-28, the challenges may be profound in different ways. So it's all to do with creating it's going back to the Eisenhower principle that plans are rubbish, but planning is essential.
Sian, how did it all go down with the MPs in the room?
Well, the MP Lincoln Jopp, who of course is a former army officer, had challenged them on the 2.5% envelope. Will that constrain the review? Doesn't it put the cart before the horse? He was saying. You could feel his frustration of the limitations of them working within that. One of the other MPs, Mike Martin, he's a former army officer as well, who'd asked if the review would be fully costed and pressed them on whether they could assure the committee that the strategic ambition would be matched with the money needed to deliver that ambition. He described their response when they said they couldn't guarantee anything as worrying afterwards. So that gives you a bit of an insight into their reactions from the costings side of stuff. What we obviously don't know is what was said to the committee in the private session that was held straight afterwards when the likes of me were politely asked to leave. But you could certainly sense just how determined they were to try and extract as much information as possible, because this was their first chance to really grill them.
Well, the reason that we're talking about all of this is because the future shape of our armed forces, and with that, our defence and security, is at stake. So getting the importance of getting it as least wrong as possible, to quote General Barrons, is self-evident. But it's been underlined by a stark new insight into how ministers are thinking. Al Carnes, Minister for Veterans and People, and himself a former Royal Marines colonel, has warned the British Army would be destroyed in 6 months to a year if it had to fight a large-scale war. Sian, again, you were in the room. That is a stark headline. Just give us a bit more context about what he was saying and how he calculates that time frame.
Well, what he said was part of a speech he made at RUSI to a conference focusing on our reserve forces. He himself has recently become a reservist. And he said, we live in very interesting, very fractious times. We have a war in Ukraine costing collectively 1,500 casualties a day. Think what that means for the number within our armed forces. And then he said, most wars are attritional in nature, and that's where the reserves come into it. He said, then he made this point: in a war of scale, not a limited intervention, but one similar to Ukraine, our army, for example, on current casualty rates would be expended, yes, part of a broader multinational coalition, in 6 months to a year. Now, he said Russia will soon be moving onto its third army in Ukraine. That doesn't mean to say we need a bigger army, he says, but it does mean you need to generate depth and mass rapidly in the event of a crisis. And then he made the point the reserves are critical, absolutely central to that process. Without them, we can't generate mass. We cannot meet the plethora of defence tasks. And of the many challenges facing recruitment into the reserves, he said to the delegates there, everything is not well in the reserve forces. It can be deeply complicated to join. He wants to see it simplified. And the head of Stratcom, General Sir Jim Hockenhull, was also there speaking. He said reserves are fundamental to our national security. He was talking about specialist reservist contributions and how they need to be baked in and not bolted on, and spoke of the importance of celebrating reserves as vital parts of our system. Of course, we don't have as many as countries like Finland and Sweden, and I think the eye is very much moving on. If a big full-scale war does happen, we need those reserves, especially within the context of what he just said about losing our entire army within 6 months to a year. So recognition there that we need to bolster our reserves, give them an incentive to sign up, in the same way that they're facing the same challenge with regular forces and recruitment and retention there.
And Mike, we're used to hearing stark warnings from backbenchers, but then getting reassurance from whoever is in government. Hearing this from a minister, some people will be thinking, why on earth are you saying this?
Yeah, because I think this government under John Healey as Defence Minister came in with the view we're going to be completely honest about this. I mean, there is a general sense, and we've talked about it endlessly on the programme over the years, that we can't go on like this. We can't carry on with our defence policy in the way that it is, facing the greater challenges that it's facing. So there's a sense that the government's going to be honest. And it's really interesting, talking about the fact that the Ukrainians and the Russians have gone through 3 armies, in a sense that they've renewed their forces. They're on the 3rd iteration of the forces, both of them. That's exactly what Britain did in the First World War. And again, we're not comparing our present situation with 20th century wars. But, in the First World War, the old contemptibles were destroyed in that first 15 months of the war, but they provided the core for Kitchener's army. And Kitchener's army was destroyed at the Battle of the Somme in 1916. But that provided the core for then the conscript army of citizens. Kitchener was the volunteer citizens. We then had a conscript army of citizens. And that was the army that became probably the finest army Britain's ever fielded in Europe and went on to win the war on the Western Front. And so, we've got to accept the fact, and this I think is what Al Khan's was talking about at the conference, is that if we're in for prolonged campaigns, not First World Wars, but prolonged military campaigns, the citizenry has to go into uniform. Now, in Britain, that will always tend to be voluntary rather than conscript, tend to be. And that means that the reserves are the follow-on army. Our first army will fight the first elements of whatever the issue is. And then our citizen army comes in to take it on. So we will go through 2 armies, let's say, in 18 months or 2 years, if we find ourselves in some sort of European conflict, which is anything like the scale of Ukraine.
And of course, the Defence Review, Mike, is meant to help make the army better able to fight a large-scale war if needed. But there is another piece of work that's been announced, a new defence industrial strategy. Again, it's going to take months. Again, the question is, how is this going to be different from the previous strategies which have us where we are today?
Yeah, and we have defence industrial strategies every 2 or 3 years. I mean, I've lost count of how many defence industrial strategies we've had. And it's not that these are poor exercises. The problem is the credibility, because industry, they're responsible to shareholders, and governments can say to them, well, we want to do things in this sort of way now. And industry nods and smiles, and privately they think, yeah, no, wait for another couple of years, there'll be a new strategy, and they'll tell us they want to do something else. And so when the government says, we must have more artillery shells, we must have more armoured vehicles, we must have more of this, we must have more air defence, industry understands that, but they're not sure that the government will still be saying that in 5 years or 8 years or 10 years' time. So they don't invest. They say, look, if you want vastly more artillery shells, we need to invest in a huge new factory in the northeast or in the West Midlands. Now, I'm not sure, is BAE Systems really going to do that unless they're sure the government will stick to this? So government's defence industrial strategies are all a matter of credibility with industry. If they can make industry believe that they will mean it in 5 years' time, in 8 years' time, in 10 years' time, then they will invest. But if they don't, they won't. Simple as that.
And it's worth noting, Sian, it is ultimately ministers who will make the decisions on the Defence Review. And of course, they are going to have to work within whatever money is available from the Treasury.
Of course, and I found it very telling that in his opening remarks to the committee, Lord Robertson opened by harkening back to the review he did in 1998 and how at that time defence spending was 2.7% of GDP, and making the point that the world has changed out of all recognition since then. He then spent the next hour reminding the committee of the scope of this review, that it is within the 2.5% envelope. And within all of those 8,000 submissions, there will be all kinds of fantastic ideas. But if there isn't a magic money tree for the ones with the big ticket price tags to fund them, then they'll probably be left on the cutting room floor.
Sian, good to hear from you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks.
Well, next we go to the Middle East, amid what looks like a further spread of instability and fighting. For several years now, Syria's civil war has seemed largely dormant, perhaps even frozen. Bashar al-Assad might not have secured a full victory, but any threat to him seemed neutralised. But quite suddenly, civil war seems to have reignited. Anti-government forces have launched their largest offensive in years and appear to have taken significant territory in the northwest, including the totemic city of Aleppo. Mike, what is happening there and why?
Well, it's a resurgence of the civil war. And these things are not entirely coincidental, although I never dismiss the power of coincidence in world politics. But this has largely been a war come back to us because this group, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, normally known as HTS, saw the opportunity of attacking Assad, of trying to displace Assad in Damascus and take over Syria in the name of a different sort of jihadi group. And the reason that they thought they could do that was because Hezbollah, who had supported Assad in the previous war very strongly, are now so diminished by what's going on next door in the Israeli-Gaza, Israeli-Lebanon war. And they also perceived that Russia, which has also supported Assad since 2015, was preoccupied in Ukraine and had already taken quite a lot of its aircraft and troops away from Syria to go to Ukraine. So they saw the opportunity and have been moving south towards Damascus, and we'll see how far they get. But they clearly are trying to displace Assad and take Syria on behalf of HTS. But that has also created a second civil war in Syria because this opportunity has been seized by Turkey, who seemed to know what was about to happen. And Turkey has used the chaos to strengthen its hold over parts of northern Syria and to pursue its war against the Kurds, who obviously is a long-term issue for Turkey. And in particular, they are attacking the PKK, which is the Kurdish terrorist group, and also the YPK, who are generally regarded as terrorists by Turkey, though not necessarily by others. So it's two civil wars have broken out simultaneously because of the knock-on effects of the Middle East war and the Ukraine war.
It's very complex, isn't it? And just a few weeks ago, we were talking about the end of Operation Shader, which started during the Syrian civil war in 2014. Although it was not an intervention directly in that civil war, it was all about eliminating the Islamic State terror group, which grew exponentially in the chaos and was a key participant in that conflict. While IS is a shadow of its former self, the dominant forces in this new pushback also come from jihadist roots. So what does it mean for us? We've been getting the thoughts of Dr. Karen von Hippel, Director General at the defence think tank RUSI. Before that, she was Chief of Staff to General John Allen when he led the international coalition against IS.
I think that the opposition organizations have come together, they've coalesced because they've seen Iran weakened by Israel, they've seen Russia distracted by Ukraine, and they very smartly thought this is a time to push ahead. Now, who knows what these groups together as a coalition will actually do? I mean, they claim one thing, they have an Islamist background, but they're claiming something very different and something more modern. But we will have to see if they win. And we've already seen now the Assad regime pushing back in a really brutal way that it had done during the civil war. So unless other countries can put pressure on Assad to go to the negotiating table, or better yet, to leave the country, it could just get ugly again. The war could drag on again, like we're seeing in Libya or in a few other places.
And does the current upsurge in fighting in Syria pose a risk to us?
I would say at the moment, I don't think the upsurge in fighting in Syria will threaten, European countries. Last time around it did, because of course many refugees fled. There is a risk that the war, if it spreads in Syria again, if it expands like it had done in the past, could, contribute to more refugees leaving the country. I mean, several million Syrians are already outside of the country. Not many have come back. A few are coming back now to Aleppo just to see their property, but I'm not sure they'll stay because already we've seen some bombing campaigns by the regime with the support of Russia. But certainly, if it deteriorates, we might see another humanitarian crisis. And that's, quite ironic because, of course, as we know, Turkey in the last few months has been trying to say to the so-called guests that they should go home. Turkey calls them guests because that way they don't have to comply with some of the international refugee laws. But Turkey has been very generous and hosting millions of Syrians over the years, as has Jordan, Lebanon, and many European countries too.
And the rise of IS and the Syrian civil war back in 2014 went hand in hand. So could this opposition surge in Syria also create a renewed jihadist power base?
It's possible that this recent fighting in Syria could lead to a resurgence of some form of the so-called Islamic State. coalescing again. I'm sure that they will be watching very carefully and trying to decide how they can jump in. They were weakened significantly in a military sense, by the coalition. And certainly, I think it was mostly eradicated in 2016, 2017. But it's possible. I don't know. I mean, this coalition opposition group is saying right now that they are not going to adhere to those kind of religious strictures. I think they would recognize that that might cause international response in the way in the past. So at the moment, I don't think so, but you never know. I mean, these, we can't defeat the ideology, as many people have said. We can defeat these groups militarily, but they will exist. They'll spread out. They're networked. They're online. They're all over the world. And so they can come together again if they have the ability and they find an opening in a vacuum, basically.
And Russia is getting more involved again. Could US and UK also have to get hands-on in Syria again?
I think behind the scenes there will be huge attempts by the UN, by others to mediate. I think that's happening now by the United Kingdom, the United States, the French and others to mediate behind the scenes. Many of the Arab states will have more sway and more pull over Assad. But, it's really hard to tell if they will regain control in about a week or so, or if this is the beginning of the end for the Assad regime. I would hope so, because he's done so much damage and he's a very weak leader. He really doesn't control the country. He rules through force and through fear, and it's just not sustainable. And Syrians, of course, deserve better.
There is some Russian movement as a result of this, Mike. Of course, a big backer of President Assad, and we can talk about that in a moment. But what about us and the US? Does this change our threat calculus and our disengagement from Syria?
Well, not a great deal, I think. I mean, I've talked to a number of people this week, ex-officials and so on, and they all say, look, we've got to just stay out of this. We as it were, lost any leverage over what happens in Syria really in 2013. You remember when Obama set red lines and the Cameron government backed them up, and then Parliament voted against it, and then the Americans backed off. So having set red lines and then ignored them, and then Russia stepped in, both to embarrass the West and then to save Assad in 2015. Since then, our interest has simply been, Op-Shader, which, we've talked about before, which was against Islamic State. And that's still, although Op-Shader is finished, we still have an agenda against Islamic State, which is a marginal agenda these days. And, we can't affect really anything that happens in Syria. We watch it with interest, and government has got to say, yes, we watch it with grave concern, because the grave concern is about the humanitarian consequences of yet more violence. But the outcome, whatever it is probably only going to be marginally better than the status quo, as Karen von Hippel was saying there. Nobody wants to see Assad remain in power, but what he'll be replaced by will probably be another form of brutal chaos. At least it turns the wheel. At least it's a brutal chaos led by somebody else who might then, the wheel might turn a bit better after that. But, that's a forlorn hope at the moment, but we've just got to stay out of it.
And Russia, last time they weren't at war in Ukraine. What do they do? And could this impact what happens in Ukraine?
It might actually, in the sense that the Russian policy is to use air power, so to bomb civilians, and they absolutely go after civilians. No question about that. There's nothing to do with accidents. They bomb civilians, and if it doesn't work, the Russians will have to decide whether to let Assad go, let him fall, in which case they lose their base at Latakia and at Tartus, or to divert troops to somehow hold the line for Assad. And they don't have enough troops at the moment easily available to divert that would make a difference. So it is possible that if this war goes on in Syria, it will stretch the Russians further, and they're already quite stretched as things are. It'll stretch them even further if it goes into the spring and summer of next year.
And regionally, you've mentioned already, it is in part linked to the Israel, Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran, Houthis multi-part conflict. But does what's happening in Syria have any potential for further regional destabilization?
Well, only in the immediate neighborhood. Whenever you look at a geopolitical map of the Middle East, the four countries that matter, the four countries that really determine the strategic future of the Middle East are Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia and Iran. And what happens in the Levant, in Lebanon and in Israel and Syria, even in Iraq, doesn't actually matter very much outside of that area. It matters hugely inside that area, and it matters hugely to the people, the ordinary people who live there. But geopolitically, no. Geopolitically, the Middle East is driven by the politics of those big four and the ways in which the outside powers choose to interact with them. And by the outside powers, we mean China, Russia, and the United States. Those are the dynamics when it really comes to the future of Middle East stability, such as it may be.
Well, let's finish in one part of the Middle East that right now is looking fairly stable and secure, Kuwait, which has been marking 125 years of significant diplomatic and military ties with the UK. Britain maintains a modest but significant military presence there. We have a foothold for regional operations and also provide Kuwait with military officers who advise and support its forces. And sometimes there are joint exercises, like the recent Iron Shield.
As you're looking at the urban village, there's so many threats. The highest casualty rate comes from urban. So you look at doors, windows, and any entrances, long threats, short threats. So overall, it's a dangerous place to be. But working through the villages, you'll realise how easy it is to obviously get hit. So that's why we train on it as hard as we can.
I think they see that we bring a lot of different skills. So our use of urban tactics is far more advanced. They've learnt a lot, I think, from us in that perspective. We've also really done a lot of drone work here with them. So we've taught them how to fly small uncrewed aircraft systems, SUAS. We've also used UAS in an urban environment.
We're using the drones for the reconnaissance, looking into the buildings before the guys get there so we can identify the enemy within the building, and it just builds the battle picture. The key thing with drones is it's an asset, not an answer. So it builds into the iStar picture. The guys are still doing sketches conventionally. We're still getting all the J2 from above, but this is just another layer to build into the battle picture.
As we know, the region has its problems, and upstream defence engagement exercises like this, where you can bring the Kuwaiti Armed Forces alongside the UK, you can practice war fighting in an exercise context, and then if you're ever called upon to operate in the region again alongside a partner like this, you can appreciate the sort of challenges that come with operating with a partner who perhaps has different language or cultural challenges that you need to overcome. So really important from a long-term defence engagement perspective.
And with us now is Brigadier Gavin Thompson, Commander of the British military mission in Kuwait. Brigadier, great to have you on Sitrep. Thank you so much for your time. Exercise Iron Shield is not some new development. It's 125 years of cooperation between the UK and Kuwait that's got us to this point, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, Kuwait is a very interesting country. This part of the Arabian Gulf, historically, if you go back 200 years, a lot of the countries in this area would raid the supply ships coming from India back to the UK. And there were sort of a lot of troublesome countries in the northern Arabian Gulf. But Kuwait was never one of those countries. It was always a country which had friendly relationships with UK. It was very important to our interests in the then Mesopotamia and Persia. And we've always had very, very friendly relationships with the country. 125 years ago, formal diplomatic relations were established, and we're celebrating that this year. And Exercise Iron Shield, I'm pleased to say, was one of the flagship events in the 125th anniversary, and it went very well.
And you command the British military mission Kuwait. Just explain what that is exactly.
Yes, so we have three main constituent parts to the British military presence in Kuwait. There is the element that is looking after the ongoing operations in Iraq and Syria, and that's operating out of Kuwaiti Air Base. We're not that. There is the element that is in the British Embassy, which is the defence section, and we're not that either. We are a third component of the British contribution to Kuwait, military contribution to Kuwait, and we operate on a thing called loan service, in which we operate, and if you look at my rank slides, we operate inside the Kuwait Armed Forces as Kuwaiti officers. We're a rank-ranged organisation from warrant officer to brigadier, and our role is to provide the support Kuwait needs to enhance its capability with reach back to UK capabilities to help them do that. We've been here in our current form since 1992, under a memorandum of understanding that was established in 1992, just after the 1991 liberation of Kuwait. And even before that, there was something similar to the current British military mission in Kuwait. But we've been here for 32 years in our current form, and we're split half and half. Half of us effectively work in the Kuwaiti Staff College as instructors, and the other half work as advisors in the command, so in the Army, in the Navy, in the Air Force, in the National Guard.
And how many British military personnel are there at any one time?
Well, I can tell you what's in the British military mission. Probably not advisable to talk about the other numbers in the other aspects, but there's 34 of us here right now. We broadly, in about 1992, there were 20, mid-20s, and we've grown a little bit over time to 34. And as I say, rank range warrant officer to brigadier. And we work alongside our Kuwaiti counterparts inside the Kuwaiti headquarters of the different forces and the different commands, and we provide direct advice to our military counterparts.
And what's the benefit for Kuwait?
So I think Kuwait likes to see the UK as a reference army. That the scale of UK army is something that's comprehensible to Kuwait, and I don't just mean the British Army. I mean Navy and Air Force as well. Obviously, they have a big presence from America in the country, but America is a much bigger force, and sometimes the way that America approaches the challenges are a little bit different to the way the UK does at the size that we do. We share many of our approaches to the world's challenges. We share similar approaches to Kuwait. So that proximity, working alongside each other, and that ability to harness the UK's experiences from operations and then build Kuwait's capability around the experiences that we have from operating around the globe means that Kuwait gets sort of first-hand advice from a very active deployed army directly into its command.
And what about the UK? What does the UK get out of it?
Well, I think if you look outside of the military sphere, Kuwait is a very, very important partner to the UK. It is a heavy investor in the UK economy, for example. There are lots of Kuwaitis with direct personal investments in the United Kingdom, so it's very, very important for the UK economy to work closely with Kuwait. It gives us some very significant military benefits in the region, in the heart of the region, in the heart of a very dynamic region, and some of those very military significant benefits like access, basing, overflight. The relationship that we have with Kuwait means that Kuwait is always open to the UK's need for that kind of facility in the Middle East. And of course, it gives the UK a small footprint in the North Arabian Gulf, which is a very, very important important part of the world.
And what about yourself? How long have you been there, and what's the experience been like?
So I'm about 18 months into this tour right now. For most of my guys, they'll probably do 3 years. Some will do more. Invariably, people who come here on a 2-year initial posting, and 9 times out of 10 they want to extend and stay here because it's a very enjoyable place to work. For me, I just find it fascinating working alongside, my Kuwaiti Arab counterparts and listening to their different perspectives on some of the same problems and challenges that we see in the UK, but they see it from just a slightly different angle, and working with them to find solutions that take in their perspective as well as our perspective. It's a really rewarding type of job to do, and it's an excellent place to live as well. For anyone who's thinking of going on loan service, I can recommend Kuwait.
And when we look at where Kuwait sits in the Middle East, of course, we remember it was invaded by Saddam Hussein's Iraq in 1990, then liberated with the help of the UK. But given its position and relationship with neighbours, and you mentioned its strategic importance, what are the priorities and what is it the most pressing in terms of concerns?
So I'd go back a little bit further. You mentioned 1990, but people might be interested to know that in 1961, the UK also deployed a force here under Operation Vantage to deter the then Iraqi leaders' intent to invade Kuwait. Almost the day after Kuwait became an independent country, Iraq threatened to invade in 1961, and the UK deployed quite a significant Operation Vantage in 1961 to deter that. So, 30 years later, 1991, there we were again, supporting Kuwait. I mean, there's no doubt about it. The North Arabian Gulf is a very volatile part of the world right now. There's no secret in that. And Kuwait sits between some very, very large and important countries. Kuwait being a very small country, but it sits just to the south of Iraq. It sits to the west of Iran and to the northeast of Saudi Arabia. And they're big, all of those countries are big geopolitical players right now. And it's very difficult for a country of the size of Kuwait to feel totally secure in and around that kind of dynamic. And of course, since October 2023, the dynamics and the tensions in the region have sort of reached another level. So yes, it's a fascinating part of the world to operate in. It is, if you like, political science in action every day as those dynamics play out, and you see that perspective from inside a small country.
And when you talk about those heightened tensions within the region, do they impact you on a daily basis, or is it just more a question of being more alert to any potential dangers?
Well, again, our ultimate safety is the fact that we operate inside Kuwait Armed Forces as Kuwaitis. So, we feel the protection that affords us. We, of course, stay vigilant. Tensions rise. There's no secrets that there's sort of tit-for-tat missile attacks between Iran and Israel have been, flying very close to Kuwait airspace. And at very sensitive times, we do adjust our posture to make sure our people stay safe. All of my officers can come here with their wives and families. So we've got wives and families to think about as well. So we do stay alive to it. But I'd say that 90% of the time it doesn't affect us. We live in a very safe country amongst friends who look after us extremely well, and we feel safe.
And why does Kuwait's security matter to us?
I think the whole region's security matters to us, and for a long time this part of the world mattered because of the oil and gas extraction from the region. But even now, as we decarbonize the economy, this part of the world is central to the trading routes that go back historically over centuries. And free and open access and trade is a fundamental UK policy, and I suspect will continue to be in the future. And therefore, friendly relations with countries in this region are vital to the UK's interests, way beyond the military, but our entire sort of way of operating as a country in the rules-based international order relies on a peace and tranquil area in the Middle East.
It's really fascinating talking to you. Thank you very much for your time, Brigadier Gavin Thompson. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mike, and what we've just heard from Brigadier Thompson is a reminder that the UK has a very widespread footprint around the world, small pockets of influence here and there.
Yeah, and it was ever thus. I was very interested in that interview for a couple of reasons. One is that I noticed, his shoulder flashes were of a Kuwaiti brigadier, not a British brigadier, because he says, I'm within the Kuwaiti forces. And the numbers he mentioned reminded me, what he was doing, just as Kitchener in the 1880s, with about that number of people, remade the Egyptian army and created what was then the most important army across the whole of the Middle East throughout most of the 20th century, most important of the Arab armies. And that was created by about the same number of people doing the same sort of thing over a century ago. And, small numbers of British trainers and people integrated make a huge difference. And something else he said, which is really interesting, which is that you can always get training from the United States, but the US Army is so big that it has a model of its own, of course, which is not necessarily the model that other countries feel that they could follow. Whereas Britain has a size, or is of a size, the British Army is sized in a way that they can relate to. So Britain has sometimes a much more appropriate sort of training to offer. But the whole thing, and this is where it goes back to the defence review, is that nobody wants to be trained by an armed force unless that force is seen to be effective and successful. Doesn't matter how good the training is, it somehow has to link back to a product, a force back in Britain that is regarded as an effective and successful army. And that takes us back to the task which the Defence Review is trying to grapple with.
Really interesting, Mike. Thank you so much for that. And thanks to all of our guests this time. That's all for now. Professor Michael Clarke and I will be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. But there is an extra edition of the Sitrep podcast online now, talking much more with Karen von Hippel about her 9 years leading the Royal United Services Institute, how the world has changed in that time and what lies ahead. That's available wherever you get your podcasts. For now, though, from me, Kate Chabot, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.